So then we are back with a more understanding from the time of the second tabernacle services, where we find the Aramaic English translation of the word. This translation comes from the original manuscripts of the prophets of the Israelic lineage, so then we can understand the time of the end. As per Yershiyahu the prophet, we find layers of understanding of the spring feast, the autumn feast, and also the returning of the cities of the Messiah laid waste from many centuries. As we read then Yershiyahu the prophet, let's then make a distinction as far as what we understand as a prophet himself, as he was sawn in half. So let's understand why then this great prophet, the prophet Yershiyahu, was then sawn in half. And many other prophets also were destroyed by Israel itself. So then let's try to understand and make a distinction as far as convenience versus then trying to manipulate the future for its own gain. We understand from the Holy Instructions that Abraham or Ibrahim, he had a couple of sons. The first son he had was then with Ibrahim and Hagar. She was a lady from Egypt. And then Ibrahim received her as then a gift from Pharaoh when Ibrahim was in Egypt. So then, Ibrahim had a son from Hagar, and he was absolutely loved. When we read, for instance, the Holy Instructions, let's try to understand where the Creator then has placed the entire situation in order not to cause strife and trouble in the tent of Ibrahim. Contrary of what then read, we find then the first and the second sons related with situations in the same tent. So let's try to understand what this truly is going. We find then the first son, Ishmael. Then you find the second son, then later became Yitzhak. As we understand, Abraham then was involved with a war. He went to war and he had many spoils of war afterwards. So he was a very wealthy man. Now, from the Creator's perspective, do you think he would cause Sarah of having a son, the son of a promise, mixed then with the first son, Ishmael, in the same tent? The very understanding itself does not make any sense. The Creator would never provide a situation where both of them would be in the same tent, because obviously it would provoke many strifes. So when we read the Holy Instructions, from what it is, from the simplicity of the events, Abraham had Ishmael prior of having Yitzhak. So then, we understand that then Ishmael became a king. He became a king of trade. So then, they had the first son. And this first son was absolutely loved by Ibrahim or Abraham. Sarah, obviously, she was then aside. And she was obviously sad for many years. But God did not forget her. He was with her. Then later, when then Ishmael was roughly 40 years old, when he was a man of making proper decisions, then Abraham felt in his very being he had to continue his pilgrimage. Isn't that amazing? This sense of pilgrimage not only was in Ishmael, because he felt the pilgrimage sense from his father Ibrahim or Abraham. Don't the Ishmaelites, they have their own yearly pilgrimage? Yet, as Ibrahim was teaching his son, or Abraham was teaching his first son, he was teaching the whole understanding as far as nations and trade. At this point in time in history, he was involved previously with a war. He won the war. He had lots of spoils of war. And during this time, he was teaching then his son, Ishmael, how to become a great manager of what Ibrahim had. So he was very influential on the land. The point is, we don't have the records of this because truly is not related with tabernacling, but however, is as important as tabernacling when comparing with the importance of the first son as the son of trade. So he was very much loved. But when he reached then 40 years old, then Ibrahim or Abraham, he felt that he had to continue on with his pilgrimage. But then his first son was already established on the land. He had companies, he had many persons working under him. He had many dozens of caravans going in every direction. Since Abraham then felt that he had to continue on with his pilgrimage only with his wife with him, Sarah, as we can understand, the mother, Hagar, and the first son, they stayed where they were at. But Ibrahim had to continue on. There was another section of the holy instructions that must be then kept and recorded. Now, as far as the sons of Ishmael, when we read the Holy Quran, what do we understand as far as the reading of the Quran? Hospitality, trustworthy, being honest, maintain one's word. These are traits that Ishmael learned from Ibrahim, from Abraham. He learned from him. And Ishmael was greatly loved. But then came a time where then Ishmael was already a great manager, not only of what Abraham had, but also the trade that he was conducting in the land. Then they separated. Then he continued on. As then Abraham then became concerned of the promise that was given him as far as having a son from Sarah, then God kept his promise. But it was far later. So both sons, they were never together. Not that we know of as far as being in the same tent with Ibrahim, because obviously it was going to cause a strife. And the Creator is not in a situation during this very early period where He's going to form His own nation. He would not let this strifing situation be in a tent where He Himself could have avoided it. So she had the son, the second son, a bit later, or much later. How many days later? We do have references that later, obviously, he had another son. So this situation of, throwing away the first wife with the son, it's not typical of the Creator. He doesn't do this. So, as far as we can understand from the holy instructions, there is a lot of crap involved in invented ideas because of anger, of wanting to become, having the supremacy in every situation. For instance, the 62nd chapter of Isaiah or Yershiyahu, you find and it's truly not crowned. Those are turbans. So what we have in our hands is understanding that the first son has half of the anointing. He is the son of trade. He has the authority of trade. He has a stick of trade. The second son had then the stick of authority of tabernacling. The second son leads the nation, gives directives to the nations, whereas the first son is involved purely with trade. But they conduct trade as being trustworthy, hospitable. They trust other people. They are honest. And these are trade the Ishmael learned from his father. So when we understand, for instance, Ezekiel the 37th chapter, and a global understanding, you find then the cities returning for the purposes of giving directives. What do we have, for instance, in the 36th chapter? The cities then being reconstructed. We have the authorities being restored. And then on the 38th chapter you find then Gog and Magog preparing for the future. So when we read the Holy Instructions and we find, for instance, the first son being thrown out of the tent in the desert, it truly does not make any sense. The Creator himself couldn't be involved with it. However, he was involved with Abraham, with Ibrahim, but he was never rejected. So literary activity and editing was then done for a long time, for many centuries. Because then the Hebrews, they tried then to do editing always to, bring the fish towards them, to the point of distorting those very instructions that were given for the sons of Ishmael. So we must understand how to read the Holy Instructions not only from a viewpoint of tabernacling, but there are sections of the Holy Instructions that did not, then the Creator Yahweh included the Gentiles. Boy, if the Gentiles were included, not having a portion with Abraham, how much more do you think the first son, being the first son with the birthright, would be involved in the Holy Instructions? Much more. The problem is the Hebrews then along the years, they were distorting the truth of these prophecies from the prophets to make themselves more important than the Ishmaelites, because they want everything for themselves. So when we read, for instance, the 62nd chapter of Yershiyahu, what do we find? You find then the first and second situations regarding then Leviticus the 23rd chapter, the spring feast and the autumn. We find then the cities being then returning. The 62nd then chapter explains then the sons of Ishmael being restored the authority of trade as Abraham had taught him. In the previous chapter then you find then the cities that were destroyed. So there is a sequence. If you observe the 61st chapter of Yershiyahu and then 37th chapter of Ezekiel, they are related. Later on you find then nations coming together for the vengeance of the time of the end. So then we can't be blind of having only a set of instructions and ignoring the other son, because the other son plays a hugely role as far as this time of the end. So then, if we give ourselves away to strife, troubles, and then throwing out a wife with the kid, then in the desert, and then speaking of an angel coming to their help, it's not the Creator. These situations were invented because they want to have every situation of the Holy Instructions only for themselves. But you can't ignore the first son. He has half of the anointing. Let me ask you this. If you were God, wouldn't you then limit the situation? Because Sarah was already a person that couldn't bear children. So the Creator had the control over her womb. Now let me ask you this. Was the Creator involved with placing Sarah and Hagar in the same tent, and then the Creator releasing her womb to have another son in order to throw the first one in the desert? You have to be joking. You have to be a murderer if you believe this kind of thing. So there is a lot of animosity and anger towards the first and second sons, and they don't get along, because then the Hebrews, they try to change the instructions, and those areas were related specific, very specific, related with the Ishmaelites, they twisted them around to make them as people of trade. As if God would take the anointing of Ishmael and give it to Yitzhak, and then making their own nations of Yitzhak there, some of them related with trade. And it's absolutely not true. So as we are then marching forward in its time of the end, we must understand who is the first son and the events that had taken place. So then the first son was established, and he was a king of trade. Now myself as a person have global understanding of the holy instructions, and not only tabernacling. Tabernacling is important, but it has its place. The world is not only tabernacling. The world is not only the temple. The world is not only the Torah. There is more in the world than the Torah. For many people, the Torah is the world, is everything, but we don't stop there. Was it not the Creator explaining of His people directing the nations in Isaiah? How they are going to direct the nations if they don't understand even the basics? During this time, they are acknowledging, for instance, the New Testament must be cleaned. And there are many people who think God is going to give them a new understanding or a new presence of Himself if they open up a new congregation. Do you know what He's going to do? He's going to show, you have then the New Testament, you have to clean it up and teach them. That's precisely what He's going to say. So people, they are living in this situation of they are so indoctrinated in what they want for themselves and their future, based from the worldly Torah they are born in, and they don't care about anybody else. But the Creator, He doesn't observe this way. That's not the way He is. Yes, tabernacling is important, but it has its place. In the world, tabernacling has its place. And there are other situations, such as Daniel the 11th chapter. You have the kingdom of the north, the Soviet Union. Kingdom of the east, China. You have the kingdom of the south, Africa. And they have their own duties from what the prophet Daniel has said. There are events taking place. But there are some people, they are only tied up with the Torah, always Torah. Torah has its place. What about the rest of it? And some people, they are fiercely blinded. You know, they only want one thing. They want this and Torah and so on and so forth. It is important. But it has its place. When it has its place, then we go another place so we understand the other prophecies, so then it can direct the other nations. So this point of simply having the wife of the first son then thrown out is absolutely crazy. How can the Creator, being so tzaddik or so just and so proper and so righteous, throwing then the first son in the desert? Come on, you have to understand the concept and the context. The Creator already had the control over the womb in Sarah. He's not going to provoke her of becoming pregnant in the midst of a situation that's going to cause strife. No, He's going to take care of first the first son. Nicely loved. Then Abraham taught what he learned from his experience with the Creator, with Melchizedek. There he was. He received a lot of understandings from this man. And during his lifetime of trusting in what the Holy Creator has spoken with him. So he gave this information to his first son, as he was the son of trade from then on. And then later on, then Sarah had another son, and it was Isaac. Thus the pilgrimage continued. But then the Hebrews, because they want to become more important than the Ishmaelites, because they were very prominent on the land, they began to change around the instructions. They began to do taka notes. And today we read sections, for instance, many of the Hebrews, they believe there were 10 plagues, and they were not 10 plagues, they were 10 dreams Pharaoh had. But they pushed themselves to learn a lie. How could then Pharaoh muster an army after the fact that then Egypt was destroyed? It gives you the information that Pharaoh had only dreams. It is true, Moses was there. After he had then slaughtered then the Egyptian was an army guy, he was from the guard. And if you are in the military and you strike down a sergeant or a person in charge of a guard, they're going to hunt you down until they find you. It is absolutely deadly sure. So then, when Moses left in Egypt, he left for his life. And he was truly far away, because if they would catch him, he would be in a bad shape. There he was, 40 years in the desert. Then, was then the experience of Moses with a burning bush a real situation? No, he had a vision while he was searching for the animal that had strayed away from his herd. He was over there trying to find this stupid animal in the mountains, and he couldn't find it. Then he had taken a rest. As Daniel, when he left his posting as Minister of Finances, he would go to the river over there, he would take a nap. That's where he had those visions. The same situation was with Moses. He was not in a real factor of having a burning bush in front of him. He is stupid. He had a vision while he was taking a rest from going after the stupid animal that ran away from his herd. In a dream, when he woke up, then he had this very sense of the presence of the divine. But what was then the situation that gave him the answer? You go visit with your brother. So when he went down and he visited with his brother, before he opened up his mouth, his brother already said, you say you had this in your mind. He knew that it was a divine link. So when we read the holy instructions, we must be cautious and careful not to invent and mystify situations. So the first son was absolutely loved, no question regarding it. And the Creator would never open up the womb of Sarah if it was going to cause a strife in a tent, in order to even to throw out the first son. Come on. And then an angel showing up to the Hagar, blah, 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 is baloney. It's BS. So then we should be concerned on how do we read the situation and start cleaning up. We have to understand the instructions for what character God is. He is not a person of a character of throwing out a boy with a mother with no protection in the midst of the desert. He doesn't do this. But then the Hebrews, they invented, because God had this idea, because God had the other idea, or because God had moved the Hagar, and then God had moved Sarah to do this and perpetuated some sort. It's BS. It's an entire section of plainly BS. It's crap. Now, there are some situations we learn from Moses. For instance, his humility he had. He was very humble. those situations we should glean for ourselves and then as an example. But as far as the Creator himself orchestrating a way of throwing out the first wife with a boy in the midst of the desert, that's murder. The Creator does not do this. So the situation was, he had his first son, Sarah was there with him, but Sarah was always humble. And believe me, there was no strife in the tent. The invention of strife and anger and one going against the other, those are inventions of the Hebrews, because they want the supremacy for themselves, even if it costs to lie and to cheat and to make taka notes in the midst of the instructions. And they were so far as slaughtering their own prophets. So truly it's a time of cleaning up the holy instructions and understanding the instructions from the character of God. God has a character. He does not throw away a wife of a servant of his in a desert, hot, and then afterwards goes an angel over there, have great courage because God is with you. It is BS. He didn't do this. Another situation is then the Hebrews, they say, the 10 plagues of Egypt. Don't we understand the wrath of God because of the unbelievers of Egypt? Now, wait a minute. Egypt, they were not aware of that there was a holy God of the universe. Once again, the character of the Creator, is he going to destroy an entire nation, not give them instructions first? So there is a lot of allegory, or then lots of anger and throwing punches everywhere, and then both sons are always fighting. And the Creator, when we read Ezekiel, he's uniting these couple of sons. He has a plan for tabernacling, and he has a plan for trade, and it involves the first son. That's why we are having then the Arabs, for instance, lowering the price of oil so then the world can work. They don't have to pay as much for oil, and they change these great discount of oil so they can produce more. They can go to work, they can produce trade. So this situation of inventing problems in the tent of Sarah and Hagar, it is BS, plain BS. So when we read areas of Yershiyahu, when we read Ezekiel, there are scores and scores of references of the people using turbans. The people using turbans outside of tabernacling means what Abraham or Ibrahim taught his son. Hospitable, being trustworthy, being honest, and being sons of pure trade, teaching the world how to do trade based from what Abraham or Ibrahim taught his son. So neither we should go to one side, neither to the other side. This side of trade has its place, tabernacling has its place. So the Gentiles, they have their places. And neither of them should engulf the other. Because the Creator has set the situation, and the situation. So please stay tuned, much more coming up.